By far, the hardest thing about making a versus video is finding enough common ground between the two artists to actually make a proper face-off and, reach a reasonable conclusion at the end of the video. And when it comes to artists that belong to two completely different genres of music, it is even harder to do so, because if we're talking about two rock artists, then it's easier. If we're talking about two rappers, then it's easier. If we're talking about two songs that belong to the same genre or share the same concept and same instrumental palette, it's obviously way more simple. But when it comes to Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley, I think we can all agree that they belong to two different realms, to the point where so many people wrongfully believe that these two had beef back in the day, even though Frank Sinatra himself in multiple performances denied it.
We work in the same way, only in different areas.
However, you can't really blame the people, since Frank Sinatra is, the literal incarnation of the word old-fashioned, and Elvis Presley is exactly the opposite. His movements, the way he presented himself, how he adopted a genre that was, at least back at the time, seen only in black people, with a few exceptions of course, how he jumped from one genre to the other. You could see him singing folk in one album, and then he went to gospel, then back to rock and roll, then he went to blues. He was basically, once again, exactly the opposite as Frank Sinatra, so it's normal to ask the question, which of the two is the better artist? However, because of how different they are, it is really complicated to reach a conclusion, so that's the reason why I must remind you that this is only my personal opinion. So if you have your own, go ahead and leave it down below in the comments, and I'll make sure to check it out. The way we do these videos, if you follow the channel, you know that we have 4 different categories, which is popularity, influence, performance, and discography. Discography being the most important one. So let's not really lose any more time. Let's go ahead with the first category, which will be popularity. And in terms of popularity, I don't really think we need to make this any longer than it needs to be, because Elvis Presley is one of the most popular human beings in the entire history of humanity. Even though I will say till the day that I die that popularity is not important and people shouldn't really care that much about it, because you guys seem to care, I just include it in every single one of these videos. When it comes to Elvis Presley, I think it's pretty safe to say that, comparing his popularity, his type of popularity to Frank Sinatra's is very complicated, since Frank Sinatra's popularity was mainly in the music and only in the music. He was never too involved with politics. He was never too involved with anything outside of music. The amount of records he sold, it's pretty impressive too, and he could be considered one of the most popular artists ever. When it comes to Elvis Presley, we're talking about the best-selling solo artist of all time, with more than 1 billion sales in records, which is ridiculous for a single human, not a band, not a group. Just a single man to sell that many records is impressive. It has a lot to do with how big his discography is too, and how many of his songs are covers, and even the originals are not really written by him. But the same thing can be said about Frank Sinatra, so I don't think that's important to to bring up. So overall, I don't really want to spend too much time in terms of popularity here, because Elvis Presley just changed the way that the country, the America, behaved. He influenced the youth, and he showed that being rebellious and being different from everyone else was actually cool as well. And overall, he had a huge impact in the way society works too, because he kind of adopted rock and roll music, which, as I said multiple times in this video, was considered as a black culture genre, and he kind of broke that a weird segregation thing that was going on in music. And in my opinion, that only goes to show how much how popular he was. One could argue that Frank Sinatra was more accepted than Elvis, by the public, because a lot of Elvis, a lot of his popularity came as a consequence of some of his controversies. However, I would argue that it doesn't really matter when it comes to popularity. Overall, Elvis mops the floor with Frank Sinatra. No mean to disrespect, honestly, but it's just it's a really wide gap between the two. So Elvis takes a point in this category, which leads us to influence, which is a way more interesting category, because in this particular case, I really had to do a lot of research. I really had to go back to the albums, because I couldn't really, reach a conclusion. I feel like Frank Sinatra changed the way we see, the album, the way albums work, the way albums are made changed thanks to Frank Sinatra. I feel like his discography shows a progression in terms of evolution and trying new things that was adopted by a lot of artists in the 60s and the 70s. And obviously his way of singing, his way of marketing the albums was also extremely influential as well, using his image a lot lot in, in the covers and in the videos and movies and what, etc. However, Elvis was influential in a different way. As I said before, I think that even though in terms of musical influence, they're both kind of on pair. Yes, Elvis Presley adopted rock and roll music, but I think it's safe to argue that a lot of the things Elvis was doing with rock music wasn't really anything new. He was just mimicking what people like Fat Dominoes and, and all these artists like Little Richard were doing at the time as well. His albums, although some of them are really good, were also basically a compilation of songs that were not really following any concept or any narrative. I would go even as far as to say that no Elvis album actually does that. The closest thing we have to an actual cohesive listen from Elvis Presley would be, the Memphis album in 1968. Every other great Elvis album out there is great because of the quality of the songs and because of how legendary and how influential they were, not really because of the cohesiveness and the flow of the album. One moment you can have a folk song like Blue Moon, for example, and I Love You Just Because, and then you have a song like That's All Right or Good Rockin' Tonight, which there's nothing wrong with that sort of like shift in the mood of the album, but the way it's done is really, it's done really poorly. And also, even sometimes the recordings, the way his voice sounds, the way the instrument sounds, don't really sound the same. So the tracks in the album in the Elvis Presley albums are really disconnected from each other. What I'm trying to say here is that I believe that in terms of pure musical influence, and only when it comes to the music, I think Frank Sinatra wins the category. However, it's not only about music. We also have to take a lot of other things into consideration, because as I said before, Elvis popularized rock and roll music. He didn't really do anything new with it, okay? So I can't really credit the music that Elvis made as direct influence to people like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. However, he did popularize it and he brought it to a lot of people's attention, so that was obviously really impactful. Clearly, when it comes to the grand scheme of things, not only the music but also the fact that he was one of the main causes of black artists being more accepted by white people. And remember, we're talking about the 50s, okay? Probably, I'm 22 years old, so thinking about a racist America in the 50s is really complicated, but that's just how, it's just the way it was. And he kind of helped both races come together, at least when it comes to music. So that's obviously a massive influence. So once again, I think that the whole point I'm trying to make here is that when it comes to music alone, Frank Sinatra did, in my opinion, more things to influence other artists. However, when it comes to the music as an industry and the world overall, I believe that Elvis was way more influential. So I'm going to give the point to Elvis. Now let's go with performance, which is one of my favorite categories to talk about, because in my opinion, when it comes to the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s, I would say the performance was super important to determine if the album was going to be good or not. When it comes to Frank Sinatra, I believe that it's pretty much obvious that he was a great performer. He was always in control of his voice, the way he carried himself, the way he moved. It always seemed so elegant and so fancy and so correct. And that is something that I do appreciate. It sounds really well in his albums. I think that the way he expressed his feelings and emotions in albums like Songs for the Swing Lovers or In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning is amazing. He's clearly an amazing performer, actually one of the greatest of all time, and one of the most influential too, because people, once again, I hate saying the same name, so let's just say artists from the 60s and 70s have him as a big inspiration. However, I think that vocal skill also has a lot to do, in the conversation of who's the best performer, and Elvis Presley is a way better singer than Frank Sinatra. Not only that, but in his catalog, you find a lot more variety, a lot more songs that push Elvis to his limits. Instead of Frank Sinatra, kind of, for the most part, I'm not saying you don't have songs where he reaches some really high or low notes with a lot of power, but for the most part in his discography, you'll find that the songs don't really push him that hard. It's always like staying in this comfort zone that, again, sounds great, but don't really give you that feeling of excitement and climax to a song. Most of the climax from a Frank Sinatra song comes from the instrumental, being more layered and louder and so on and so forth, not really him singing that loud. Of course, once again, you have things like That's Life and My Way way, which are complete exceptions of the rule because his vocal performance in the songs is amazing. But overall, I think that Elvis has a lot more songs where he clearly has major control but also passion at the time of performing the songs, like Are You Lonesome Tonight, like In the Ghetto, for example, Suspicious Minds, Heartbreak Hotel, Jailhouse Rock. Like, you listen to those set of songs that I just mentioned in this 5 seconds, and you'll see the range of Elvis, his voice, and the many different genres and styles he could adopt and use. And I personally find that remarkable, to the point where I would argue that he is one of the greatest performers of all time, in the conversation of being in the top 5, at least in my opinion, especially since I uploaded a video a couple of weeks ago, asking the question, is Elvis Presley overrated? You guys loved that video, but in that video, I was able to go and research his discography and take a deep dive into it, which I've never really done before. I've heard all of his albums before, don't get me wrong, but I never actually paid attention to how many different styles of music he was making at the same time. Like, in the same year, he was doing rock and roll, he was doing gospel, folk music, country, all of these different styles that require your voice to sound in a totally different way, so many different types of recordings and I was just baffled. And I can't really give the point to Frank Sinatra, even though maybe he has the most recognizable style of performance. I would argue that every time you listen to Elvis Presley, that man sings his heart out, and he knows how to express emotions. He knows how to be elegant and fancy like Frank Sinatra is. He knows how to be romantic, but he also knows how to be a player. So overall, I'm gonna give this point to Elvis. He definitely is the best performer out of the two, which leads us to my favorite and the most important category in this sort of videos, because we're talking about discography, which once again, even if it's 3-0 in favor of Elvis, if Frank Sinatra takes a point in this category, I would argue that Frank Sinatra wins, or at least I would rather listening to Frank Sinatra overall. And also, it's funny that I think that way, because this was the hardest to come up with a conclusion, out of all the categories in this video, because both discographies are kind of a mess. I'm not saying they're bad, I'm not saying they have bad songs. I am saying that both Elvis and Frank Sinatra were victims of the way that records were used at the time. Once again, this is prior to social media, prior to streaming, prior to MTV, posting your videos out there, prior to a lot of things that help artists focus more on the integrity in terms of artistry of their album, rather than trying to get as many hits as possible in the record, because all the album covers were really similar. The promotion was just like copy and paste for a lot of artists at the time. So going to a record store and buying an album was was basically just, I want to see the list of songs I enjoy the most. So you have a lot of jazz standards when it comes to Frank Sinatra, and the same thing can be said about Elvis when it comes to rock and roll songs. And once again, he used to sing a couple jazz songs here and there too. What I'm trying to say here is that both discographies have a lot of albums that are basically a compilation of covers or songs written by someone else that kind of align with what the public wanted. And also, if I tell you you like the song Fly Me to the Moon by Frank Sinatra, tell me in which album it was released. You like the song That's Life by Frank Sinatra, tell me where can you find that song. You like the song Can't Help Falling in Love by Elvis Presley, in which album was that song released? And you won't be able to give me an answer, because again, the discography is a mess. You have a lot of albums released in a really short amount of time, and especially when you dive into the 60s, where people like Pink Floyd, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, The Who, Led Zeppelin, all of these different artists were releasing albums that were way more cohesive and that flowed way better. You can obviously tell that a lot of these albums suffered from the overall marketing that needed to be done in order for the album to sell. But I think that the overall quality that you'll find in Elvis Presley's discography is gonna be better than the one you'll find in Sinatra's, not only because it has better songs and that feel a lot more original, but also you'll have a lot more variety from album to album. Once again, you have rock and roll, you have blues, you have folk, you have country, you have gospel, you have pop music. You have a variety of genres to enjoy in Elvis, in his discography. You have live albums. You just have a bunch of things that feel way more entertaining overall, right? Instead, Frank Sinatra's discography can basically be put under the jazz genre, you know, the swinging songs, and I personally don't have a problem with it. It's obvious that he was a jazz musician and that was where he was happy, and that's perfectly fine. But I do find his discography to be a little bit more tacky, because it feels like the songs are the same and the same all over again, and it's a little bit boring, I'm not gonna lie. However, I would argue that Frank Sinatra's discography is way more organized than Elvis's. I feel like when you look at the Frank Sinatra albums from start to finish, you can find progression. You can, you know, hear songs like In the Wee Small Hours, and then from the songs from the Swinging Lovers, and then Come Fly With Me, September My Years, you know, Capitol Records. You'll find that the albums are cohesive. The albums flow way better than, you know, any Elvis album out there, even his best ones. So I would argue that in that case, I would very much rather listening to a Frank Sinatra album. So I'm kind of like torn between the two. Frank Sinatra's discography is way more cohesive. Elvis Presley's discography is like, you know, more enjoyable and has the better songs. So I don't really know where to go. So I'm just gonna leave this as a tie, because as much as I've been thinking about this for the entire day, and still I can't seem to choose one discography. I tried my best and I couldn't do it, so I'm just gonna leave it as a draw, and both of them get a point. Now let's go to the conclusion, and I'm pretty sure if you paid attention to the video, it's pretty obvious that I think Elvis is the better artist out of the two. Once again, I think Elvis, you know, his legacy transcended music. He is not only known as a singer, but as a major figure for, you know, the music industry. Everyone, when you think of music, I think more often than not, you'll think about Elvis rather than Frank Sinatra. And I think that speaks volumes when it comes to the artist's legacy, which pretty much is what we're talking about here, right? I think that without Frank Sinatra, I don't really see the music industry being that much different from what it is now. Instead, without Elvis, I literally couldn't imagine the 60s even happening. Overall, I think that even though Frank Sinatra was really important for music, and for a number of people watching this video, they would much rather listening to a way more organized and overall, you know, just simple discography like Frank Sinatra's. I think that overall, when you look at everything that Elvis did for music, when you look at his songs, his, you know, albums, how he literally created a new peak for a musician to reach, and, you know, overall, I think that the only reasonable conclusion for this video is to give Elvis the win, because I personally think he's the better artist. That'll be it for today's video, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the videos that I upload. Please do remember, once again, I said at the beginning of the video, I'm going to say it at the end, this is only my personal opinion. So if you have your own, I'm pretty sure you do, go ahead and leave it down below in the comments so we can have a small conversation in the comments section. Also, if you want me to talk about any other artist, if you want me to do any other type of video, if you want me to talk about a certain album, song, or artist, go ahead and leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you guys enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.